Glad I did.
Good evening and welcome to the National Association of Scholars. This is an event where we are going to be hearing from three distinguished speakers, but this is also the inaugural event for NAS's newest offices. We move every 5 years. We've moved here now, and here provides us with a space where we can invite our friends and strangers who are interested in what we do to come to some interesting talks. So this is the first of those events. I hope there will be many more, and I hope we will see you again. Thank you for coming out on a Friday evening. I know that's not convenient for everybody, but your dedication as a parent and your being here. This event is titled, among other things, WWW, which used to mean the World Wide Web, but instead it means Weiss, Widdowson, and Wax. And these three women are extremely distinguished scholars. They are the kinds of people that give us some warrant to call ourselves the National Association of Scholars. Amy is a member of our board and has been for some time. Elizabeth is a more recent member of our board. So we are here distinguished not only by their scholarship, but by their dedication to service in a severely disrupted academy. Now, I'm not going to step on any of their lines because they all have stories to tell of the mistreatment meted out to people who dissent from the orthodoxies of today's academy, and they tell these stories extremely well. I've heard all three of them on the matter, so I'm going to just stick to a few of the basics of who they are if you don't already know them. The order in which they speak will be Elizabeth first. Elizabeth has a bachelor's degree from the University of California, a PhD from the University of Arkansas, and please silence your phones, was tenured at San Jose State in 2004. That's something she has in common with the other two speakers. All three of these individuals were tenured academics, and all three of them have faced severe persecution. Two of them are now ousted from their universities. One of them is hanging on, I would like to say, by her fingernails, but we're going to find out about that. Professor Widdowson's PhD is from York University, undergraduate degree from the University of Victoria, and her career has been spent in Canada. She is here from Calgary, so she is a very active member of our Canadian counterpart, the Society for Academic Freedom, I think it's called, and she and I met at one of their meetings several years ago. She has been, let's say, probably not as well understood south of the Canadian border as she should be, because she's fighting a very lonely battle for her career and reputation in Canada. And I hope that we'll get a very clear view of that by the end of the evening. Amy Wax, who I've known for quite a while, has an extremely unusual background. Her bachelor's degree from Yale was in molecular biology. She went on with a Marshall Scholarship to Somerville College, Oxford, from which she took a master's in philosophy, then enrolled in a dual medical and law program at Harvard. She finished the medical degree, became an active physician for several years, and then returned to law, taking her final law degree from Columbia in 1987. She's gone on to have a lustrous career in the law, and I would say was just completely unblemished with teaching awards galore until somehow she stepped on a politically correct landmine, which has upended her life and her career. And Amy will tell us about that. One other thread that ties at least two of our speakers together has to do with Native Americans. As many of you know, I'm an anthropologist. Elizabeth is as well. Professor Widdowson is not an anthropologist, but has a close adjacency to it. And they have worked in the field of trying to, let's say, question some of the mythologizing of Native Americans that has taken hold in the academy in the last several years. And in Canada, some of you may remember this, a giant national scandal erupted when it was claimed that the residential schools to which indigenous children had been sent earlier in the century were in fact something like death factories. A lot of the children were killed or died under mysterious circumstances and were buried on the grounds of these schools. Nobody seemed to be willing to look for evidence of this actually happening, and Frances raised the question of whether it actually did, and that was a very unwelcome question. That's not the only time that she has found herself running afoul of the received sentiments on campus and in the nation, but in this case, she touched on something that hit a bruise on the Canadian conscience. And that is, Canadians are really, really eager to believe that they are horrible people who perpetrated this immense injustice on their native residents. And to question that at all proves to be a difficult undertaking. I said I would not step on anybody's lines. I'm sure there's a lot more to be said about this. I'm going to turn this over to Elizabeth right now. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Peter and National Association of Scholars, for putting this event on. Throughout my years as a professor at San Jose State University, I had seen the harm personal ad hominem attacks can have. Early on, this became apparent in student evaluations when students referred to professors' voices as annoying, made fun of what a professor wore, or even mocked their professor's appearance. This is not a new problem, and yet I'd seen professors in tears over these attacks. Some lecturers stopped teaching as a result. Students can be cruel. What I hadn't foreseen is that these same tactics would be levied against those debating contentious issues. Rather than argue with reason or data, the attacks, this time coming mainly from graduate students and other professors, are exceedingly personal. The personal attacks against me arose initially from my anti-reburial position. I'm a physical anthropologist whose main area of expertise revolves around the study of skeletal remains found in the archaeological record to reconstruct the past. Some call this bioarchaeology. Due to my desire to most accurately reconstruct the past, I have been a vocal opponent of repatriation and reburial laws, like the federal law, NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and California's version called CalNAGPRA. These laws aim to give skeletal collections to modern tribes, often tribes with no true link to the people in the skeletal collection, for reburial. My arguments against reburial and repatriation are multiple. I've written, with the help of now retired attorney James Springer, that these laws violate the First Amendment of the Constitution that includes separation of the church and state. The laws are religious laws that support and therefore establish a specific religion over other religions. That is, they require anthropologists like me to hand over collections based on the words of Native American traditional Indian religious leaders. They also allow Native American creation myths to be used as evidence in determining links between past peoples and modern tribes. And each meeting is even started and ended with a traditional Native American prayer. As an aside, no one really knows what traditional Indian religion is, because before contact with Europeans, the Native Americans lived in a practical Stone Age with no written language. Their current prayers and traditions are a hodgepodge of animism, Catholicism, and New Age beliefs. If the laws treated all religious tales alike and allowed for any religious leader on the committees, then one could more easily erase concerns about the violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. I'm also against these laws because they are an offshoot of postmodern identity politics. In our 2020 book, Repatriation and Erasing the Past, Jim and I discussed how repatriation ideology, which includes the repatriation and reburial laws, as well as the current state of anthropological and archaeological research on America's past, is postmodern because it divides the world into the oppressed victims and the oppressors. In postmodern anthropology and archaeology, who tells the story is important, and not whether the story is actually true. The postmodern repatriation ideology is also found in the Biden administration's Indigenous Knowledge Mandate, which buys into the Indigenous Knowledge is Science meme on the basis of listening to the victim narratives of Native Americans on everything from biological research to fire management. It isn't science, of course. It's myth and religion. The irony here is that the left's rose-tinted view of all things indigenous is the modern embodiment of the noble savage myth, which is actually a racist worldview. In this case, the victims, the Native Americans, are the important narrators, and whether their narrative has any truth to it at all is irrelevant to postmodern anthropologists. Thus, if they say that the 10,000-year-old remains are from their ancestors and should be reburied, then postmodernists will agree to that reburial. Recently, an art exhibit of a centaur that was created over 30 years ago to highlight how hoaxes can arise and teach students and visitors to be critical of such discoveries has been repatriated to a Wisconsin Indian tribe. Even though the horse remains came from a vet school, the skull came from India, and the quote-unquote Greek artifacts were fakes. The tribe even claimed the glass display case because it held human remains and now had a quote-unquote spiritual link to the bones. This was only the latest absurdity. Previous repatriations included a Spanish breastplate and even a root beer bottle. Now the acceptance of any Native American narrative is baked into both California and federal reburial laws. Native Americans are considered expert witnesses and are therefore not to be questioned. Furthermore, if there is a disagreement between Native Americans' narratives and scientific facts, deference must be given to the Native Americans. I also think that skeletal collections are of the utmost importance to forensic anthropology research and training, the teaching of anatomy, and making progress to understanding bone health and disease through time. I am of the opinion that it would be a good idea to move toward a decoupling of the body and the spirit or person when it comes to death and the treatment of human remains. And thus I am against the reburial of all remains. Recently, when 4,000-year-old remains from Berlin were reburied, I had spoken up against this action too. Some may argue that this is an impossible ask, but I point out that organ donations have vastly increased even in deeply religious countries as a result of campaigns that put forth the argument that donations help others. I've always encouraged my students to consider body and organ donations for themselves, preferably after they're dead. For putting forth these and other arguments, I have faced a barrage of ad hominem attacks. On the internet, I was called a ghoul, a grave robber, and ugly. References to being a skinny bitch and that I should dig up some hair conditioner were also common. I was called a eugenicist, a Nazi, a white supremacist, and a racist. Unfortunately, a look at who left these comments revealed that they were being left by graduate students, i.e., the next generation of academics, and professors. These tweeted insults left the Twitterverse and entered into more consequential environments, such as emails to my supervisors where I was called a narcissistic cunt. And the response against the talk I was to give at the American Anthropological Association conference on the importance of sex differences in bones to help in understanding everything from reconstructing the past to identifying homicide victims, the president of the association compared me to a eugenicist. And recently in a Newsweek article, a professor from my own university, San Jose State, compared my fight to preserve skeletal collections to the murderous acts depicted in the movie Killers of the Flower Moon. My chair, the NAGPRA coordinator, and the tribal liaison at San Jose State University all engaged in such name calling. In public talks and behind-the-scene emails with tribal members while working in cahoots to derail my career and prevent me from ever working with skeletal remains again. Nearly all the ad hominem attacks came from liberals. One exception was when I spoke about research conducted at forensic anthropology on men who had undergone feminization surgery, the type that alters bones, in order to see if these men could be identified as men, women, or neither when using forensic skeletal databases such as Fordisk. By the way, the data show that these men are still identified as men. Due to my highlighting this research, I was called a man, or trans, by the gender critical crowd, those who correctly state that sex is binary, biological, and cannot be changed. Even though I wasn't advocating for this surgery or for equating men who want to be women with women. Never before had such an insult been aimed at me. Nevertheless, most of those using ad hominem attacks are evading the issues. They're not addressing the controversies because the data are not on their side. They know that they cannot win with facts and thus attack the person. Repeatedly, I had offered to have a civil debate with those who are for repatriation and reburial, or for those who allege that sex is not binary. It seems, however, that the left, and it is almost universally the left, have given up on debating the issues and resort to name-calling instead. Name-calling is evidence of a weak or lazy mindset, and we may not be surprised when it comes to an undergraduate who's upset that they're failing my class and has not developed the technique to understand how to debate with facts. But scholars, even young ones, should rise above and argue with reason and data. Fortunately, name-calling does not bother me. I still grew up with the rhyme going through my head, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Yet, one shouldn't need such an outlook to conduct research or fight for academic freedom. Nevertheless, this uncivil environment has frightened away some real researchers. I've received emails from others who discuss their hesitancy to step into controversial topics and into this arena. For instance, I received a recent email from a tenured full professor in California who wrote to me that, quote, "My own personality is very conflict avoidant. I don't like to be at the center of attention, and I don't like arguing with people. So my resolution to all this is to shift my research to other regions and topics that are less controversial," end quote. Well, I too don't like to argue with people, but we need to debate the issues to save the science. That is what scholarship is all about. For more on this topic and other related issues, do please consider reading my latest book, On the Warpath, My Battles with Indians, Pretendians, and Woke Warriors. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. My name is Frances Widdowson. I was a professor at Mount Royal University from 2008 to 2021. On December 20th, 2021, I was fired from Mount Royal University for satirical tweets that Indigenous activists and a trans activist became upset about and complained about. The most bizarre situation was one of the Indigenous activists was trying to get me fired and trying to mobilize an anonymous, supposedly student-led group to complain about me, and I satirized her attempts to get me fired because she claimed to be loving and kind and just trying to bring people together with humility and grace. So whenever I referred to her, I would refer to her as a loving and kind professor who just likes to bring people together with humility and grace. And this resulted in me being found to have harassed her. So it's a rather strange. I keep on expecting someone rational to enter into this and say this is crazy what has happened, but so far this hasn't occurred. My case went through I had to wait a year and a half for arbitration. I went through a year of arbitration proceedings, 30 hearing days, 8 days on the stand, and in the end it was found that I shouldn't have been terminated, but because the Indigenous activists feel unsafe at me being in the university, I shouldn't be allowed to return to my job. Anyway, this is all documented on the website www.wokeacademy.info, and it is currently under appeal. The case is going to be appealed. We're just going through the various machinations now to get the final documents put together. So that is the story in brief of my firing from Mount Royal University. My presentation today is called Personal Attacks That Hide Facts, Widdowson's Residential School Denialism of Clandestine Burials and Indigenous Genocide. And I start off my talk with a quote from the famous philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. And Schopenhauer said, "All truth passes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. And third, it is accepted as being self-evident." Schopenhauer's assertion about the stages of truth is pertinent to this event, as the personal attacks that Amy Wax, Elizabeth Weiss, and I have endured are a form of ridicule that delegitimizes our logical and evidence-based arguments. This justifies our cancellation and the attempts to push us out of the academy. In my case, the personal attacks that have occurred are a reaction to the truthful things that I have said about Indigenous policy in Canada. More recently, the truth that is being hidden by these personal attacks pertains to the discoveries of unmarked graves at residential schools and the false claim that these are clandestine burials. And there so far is no evidence of any clandestine burials, although there are unmarked graves in cemeteries that were originally marked, but the markers deteriorated, so they are now unmarked. The personal attacks began against me in 1996, almost 30 years ago, with the criticisms that Albert Howard and I put forward about the government of the Northwest Territories' Aboriginal traditional knowledge policy and its directive to integrate Aboriginal traditional knowledge into all government programs. In response to our arguments that traditional knowledge was comprised of unsystematic observations and spiritual beliefs, and therefore was less rigorous than scientific methods, we were accused of ignorance and being prejudiced towards Aboriginal people. Our experience with analyzing Aboriginal traditional knowledge led us to understand that Indigenous policy was being driven by a self-serving industry of lawyers and consultants who fueled grievances to divert government funding away from much-needed programs and services for Indigenous people. Intensive programs and services were needed to address the lower level of cultural development that existed in isolated Indigenous communities, but the Aboriginal industry was intent only on making demands that more money be dispersed to Indigenous leaders, so that could be circulated by them to their privileged friends and relatives. These circumstances were being kept hidden because the accusations of racism meant that there was fear in discussing Indigenous policy openly and honestly. Albert Howard and I documented this in our book, Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry, The Deception Behind Indigenous Cultural Preservation. My difficulties in speaking freely in the government led me to decide to pursue an academic career. After obtaining a doctorate in political science at York University in Toronto, I was hired by Mount Royal University in 2008. While my academic freedom was initially protected by MRU's academic ethos and wonderful scholars like Provost Robin Fisher and Dean Manuel Merton, their retirement paved the way for the university to be overtaken by professional administrators and lawyer managers. At two periods, 2014 and 2020, there were significant declines in the academic character of MRU and its ability to protect dissenting opinions. 2014 marked the beginnings of MRU's indigenization journey, while 2020 was the year George Floyd died in police custody, resulting in a massive increase in anti-racism advocacy. In 2015, a famous commission in Canada called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its report on the residential schools and the assertion that this form of education that was carried out by the schools constituted what they called cultural genocide. And this was accepted by many universities and other institutions. This led the attack of what is called residential school denialism, where denying that the residential schools were genocidal was equated with Holocaust denial. And this began to gain legitimacy because of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report. At MRU, this culminated in a 2020 motion passed in General Faculties Council. And General Faculties Council is the body that makes all academic decisions at the university. And this motion declared, quote, that Mount Royal University acknowledges the genocide done to Indigenous peoples by colonization and the trauma inflicted by the residential school system, and that this acknowledgement brings a responsibility to provide a culturally safe learning and work environment in accordance with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's findings and MRU's Indigenous Strategic Plan. And the strategic plan was in large part to respect and recognize what was called Indigenous ways of knowing, which were not ways of knowing, they were the beliefs of Indigenous people. The allegation of genocide was entrenched in popular consciousness on May 27th, 2021, when the Kamloops Indian Band declared, quote, the confirmation of the remains of 215 children who were students of the Kamloops Indian Residential School, unquote, and maintained that some of these children were as young as 3 years old. It was also stated that a juvenile tooth and human rib bone had been found in the area, as well as the fact that there were quote unquote knowledge keepers, oral histories that recall, quote, children as young as 6 years old being woken in the middle of the night to dig holes for burials in the apple orchard. It was these three factors, we were told, that resulted in the decision to survey the apple orchard at this time with ground-penetrating radar. Because of the Kamloops Indian Band's announcement, there was an outpouring of grief and recriminations in universities. At Mount Royal University, for example, my university, the president, Tim Raleigh, stated, quote, "The discovery of 215 innocent children found buried in unmarked graves at the site of the former residential school in Kamloops is nothing short of devastating. My heart goes out to everyone in our campus community feeling the impact of this discovery and the intergenerational trauma of residential schools." Raleigh recommended that we look at the statement of Dr. Linda Manyguns, the Vice President of Indigenization and Decolonization, who offered her condolences and support upon the discovery of the remains of 215 children buried at the site of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School, commiserating that we must face the horror and commit to finding the others who went missing, unquote. The president of my faculty association, the union that is currently representing me, also weighed in on the matter. He stated that he was horrified by the discovery of the bodies of 215 children at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, and that as president of the MRFA, I want to express my support and solidarity with our Indigenous colleagues who are reeling from yet more evidence of the residential school system and its genocidal intent. One of these Indigenous colleagues, Gabrielle Lindstrom, or should I say the loving and kind Gabrielle Lindstrom, who brings people together with humility and grace, maintained on Twitter that 215 little ones had been murdered at KIRS. The statement was supported by numerous MRU professors. One colleague, Tim Haney, even argued that, quote, "the murders of hundreds," and then in question mark, thousands of Indigenous children in Canada's Catholic residential schools meant that people should not be blamed for burning over 60 churches that had happened in retaliation after the Kamloops announcement was made. Because I had been involved in critically analyzing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's findings since 2016, and had examined the role of the Aboriginal industry in extracting transfers on the basis of highly improbable oral histories, I was skeptical about the Kamloops Indian Band's claims. This led me to organize a panel with Brian Giesbrecht, Rodney Clifton, and Paul Viminetz, colleagues of mine, with the title, quote, "Can we discuss those in unmarked graves," unquote. And this was in July 10th, 2021, about a month and a half after the Kamloops announcement. We all pointed out that the reaction to the Kamloops announcement was premature, and as no evidence had yet been provided about the existence of remains. My presentation asserted that discussion of the unmarked graves was possible, but this could be undertaken only at your peril, as you would be accused of residential school denialism, genocide denial. This, in fact, was the reaction of Sean Carlton and Daniel Heath Justice, professors at the University of Manitoba and the University of British Columbia, respectively. And this was their reaction to the event. Carlton characterized it as a bonanza of residential school denialism, and stated that because we were not historians, we could not be experts on the residential schools. Heath Justice asserted that, quote, "As predicted, Widdowson is crawling up from the denialism depths to stump for her long-promised residential schools were good genocide apologist project, unquote. Our presentations, however, turned out to be prescient. 5 days later, Dr. Sarah Bollier, the GPR expert hired by the band to do the survey, gave a presentation and stated that it was only 200 anomalies or targets of interest, not human remains, that had been discovered. The 250 number was revised to 200 because of excavations that had been previously undertaken in that area. This was presumably the digs of the Simon Fraser Archaeology Department, which had been undertaking research in the area for decades. The revision raised the question of why the other 200 anomalies could not be similar soil disturbances, such as irrigation trenches and the septic tiles laid decades ago. And there's a website called Graves in the Apple Orchard by a person by the name of Cam Rez, who documents the 100 years of excavations that took place on the site, which is very likely that's what the ground penetrating radar discovered. In addition to the many excavations undertaken at the site for over 100 years, the other circumstance that cast doubt on 200 clandestine burials existing in the apple orchard is that not one parent has claimed that their child went missing from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. If this is the case, who would comprise the 200 children, quote, some as young as 3 years old, who were supposedly buried secretly in the middle of the night in this apple orchard? Bollier's presentation declaring that no remains had been found, however, had no impact on the reporting of the Kamloops case. This led to the formation of a dissident research group led by an I.F. Stone type figure, Nina Green. On the basis of Green's meticulous and comprehensive research, I was able to write the piece Billy Remembers in the American Conservative, which showed how the response to the Kamloops announcement was a kind of hysteria, similar to the satanic panic in the 1980s and the 1990s. This piece, along with many others written by the research group, eventually resulted in the edited volume, Grave Error: How the Media Misled Us and the Truth About Residential Schools, edited by Chris Champion and Tom Flanagan in December 2023. Grave Error provided a comprehensive debunking of the Kamloops case, as well as other searches for unmarked graves that have not turned up one clandestine burial. All the remains that have been discovered are in cemeteries where the grave markers have deteriorated. This brings us to where we are today. What is the state of the truth about the unmarked graves and the allegations of genocide? Because the Kamloops announcement was what really solidified the fact that Canada was a genocidal country. Although hundreds of millions of dollars have been allocated for fruitless searches, the pressure to find non-existent, quote-unquote, missing children continues. There are no missing children. There is no documentation of any missing child. This is largely due to the fact that the attack of residential school denialism has made most afraid to challenge the rent-seeking demands driven by the Aboriginal industry. Even efforts to reduce the money available for searches has been unsuccessful, as Indigenous activists and their allies have accused the government of failing to support what's called truth and reconciliation efforts. Because of these attempts to suppress the truth, there is now even a push to make, quote-unquote, residential school denialism illegal, hate speech under the Criminal Code of Canada. This means that we are heading into the second phase that Schopenhauer identified, as ridicule is becoming less effective in stopping skeptical views from being expressed, violent opposition will become necessary. State-sanctioned coercion is now required to prevent the self-evident truth from emerging about non-existent clandestine burials and the genocide that never was. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak at this NAS panel with such distinguished participants. My personal experience as a prosecutor and accused academic, who, despite the best efforts of my university, has not quite been canceled yet, is a topic on which I could talk for quite a while, but I don't have unlimited time. So let me say that I'm not going to use my few minutes here to review the long litany of charges against me made over many years at my university, sort of a Mikado-like scroll of accusations and allegations, and lately charges of abusing my students, a sort of desperate ploy motivated by my university's fear that their other charges won't stick. The internet relieves me of that. There are numerous media reports so that you can look at, many of them, of course, distorted and tilted. But I would say that Aaron Sabarium at the Washington Free Beacon has done an excellent and fair job of following my saga, and his articles are readily available. Now, in reviewing for this panel the long list of charges against me, which the university keeps adding to, there are particular aspects of my treatment that stand out. Perhaps the most egregious and desperate and dishonest is my university, that is Penn, University of Pennsylvania's insistence on persistently calling my supposedly objectionable statements behavior and denying that they are speech at all, let alone protected speech. Now, red alert, speech is behavior, but it is not just behavior, it is protected behavior. It is hard to know what to say to this bizarre attempt to separate behavior and speech. Excuse me, all the accusations against me are based on things I have said, my words, both within and outside the university setting. They are speech. The second exasperating aspect of the case is that Penn is not satisfied with just listing the statements the university objects to, listing them accurately, stating what is wrong with them, the rules they violate. In fact, no rules have been cited, and with very few exceptions, no reasons have been given. Rather, in typical insecure fashion, the allegations are persistently distorted, twisted, and misrepresented. They misrepresent my words and the gist of the points I am making, amounting in some cases just to outright fabrications, making stuff up, as they say. I can give but one example of distortion of my words. There are dozens, okay? At a Washington, D.C. meeting in 2019, I advocated for an immigration policy favoring people from democracies similar to our own. And I explained that, well, that might have a side effect on the racial and ethnic composition of who's admitted, more Europeans maybe, fewer third worlders. That might be regrettable by some people as a byproduct, but I still think the policy was wise. The immediate reaction was, quote, Wax says the country is better off with more white people and fewer non-white people. Now, that's not what I said. That's not what I meant. I could keep you here for a long time with similar examples of absurd distortions and accusations that simply do not reflect the gist of my remarks, that are completely benign, that are audacious fabrications. And one could ask, why did my dean, the one who brought the charges initially, Dean Ted Ruger, now former dean, with the university's backing, decide to do this to me? Why target a funny little old lady who is entirely harmless, as one of the students who testified on my behalf at my 3-day trial described me? My 3-day surreal kangaroo court at Penn. Is it personal? Is it political? Is it both? Is it neither? The answer, of course, is that it is both. And that targeting professors like me serves very important political goals, which in turn generates some very important personal effects. My university is alarmed that I dare to deviate from the political agenda that dominates on campus, the woke agenda, obsessed with identity, oppressor and oppressed, racial harms, the biased narrative, etc., etc. I don't need to detail this because it is everywhere. No alternative explanation for the social facts about minority disadvantage is allowed. That's the bottom line, except oppression. And there are lots of corollaries relating to white supremacy, immigration, hence the panic over my restrictionist arguments, sexuality, homosexuality, multiculturalism, etc. And my indictment insists that I have run afoul of each and every one of these orthodoxies at some point in time. Now, anybody who does that within the university is immediately deemed a subversive influence, a heretic, a contaminant. That person must be silenced or at least punished as a warning to others. Which brings me to the personal side and some very important persons within the university who are deeply affected by this, and they are the students. What I think the universities find intensely threatening is that when people like me on campus, the rare dissenters, actually speak up and question the woke catechism, the students are exposed to points of view that might cause some of them to question that catechism, right? Might encourage those who already do question it, but are silent and intimidated and feel isolated, to speak out and start discussing their doubts. I can affirm from experience that the vast majority of the students that I have taught at Penn Law have received a thoroughly one-sided education, even at the most expensive and prestigious institutions, and many of them have attended such institutions from kindergarten on up. They come to law school without ever having heard a well-articulated reasoned challenge to the lefty point of view on virtually every topic. It is not, I think, an exaggeration to say that they have been indoctrinated from the cradle, maybe ab ovo actually, on up. And I provide the challenge. And for some students, it is an eye-opener. I know that because I have students taking my courses, reaching out to me, talking to me about their concerns and their dismay at the cast of their prior education. I call them my hardy band. And there have been dozens just at my own university. And of course, my university is not happy about that. What is the effect on these students of the way of the university's very public and also in many ways sneaky moves to punish the likes of me? Such initiatives send a very clear message. Don't question the received wisdom. Don't say what you really think, or bad things will happen. Keep your head down. Shut up, or you will be treated like Professor Wax. Now, this is a clever and well-established, tried and true ploy, and it is efficient. Make an example of one person, and everybody else gets the message. Now, without giving you the sorry details of my saga at Penn, I will give you the bottom line and tell you what is currently happening, because I want to continue my theme of how the students are the most important people here. The Faculty Senate Committee that heard my case chose not to fire me, amazingly, but imposed a substantial pay cut, including permanent loss of all research funds, which is a good chunk of my compensation, and a year-long suspension, whatever that means, plus a reprimand. And I was actually sent a draft of the reprimand, which I will assure you is about at the level of what a middle schooler in Wichita, Kansas would come up with before her parents went over it. The penalty and the disposition were rubber stamped by then President Liz McGill, we know what happened to her, and a review committee, and was finalized at the end of May. But at the last minute, before it was implemented and the reprimand was posted, the interim president, Larry Jameson, agreed to meet with me at my request. I sent a Hail Mary pass. I directly emailed the president and said, we need to talk. Because I don't think that my going to court against Penn, which I fully intend to do, is good for Penn and its reputation at this point in time. Remember, this was after October 7th. And I think it's really bad for the students. And you know that you and I deeply care about the students. We share that concern, Larry, don't we? And what do you know? He emailed me back, but not before the general counsel called my lawyer and said, I will not permit the president to meet with Amy Wax unless she agrees to quit. And my lawyer, to his credit, said, do you work for him or does he work for you? Now, I think my points hit home in the wake of October 7th because the university made a number of statements about their commitment to academic freedom, how their hands were tied so they couldn't sanction the pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas demonstrators, including one infamous Wayne Booth, an Annenberg Communication School professor whose specialty is political cartoons, who created and published a number of cartoons, including depictions of Israelis drinking Palestinians' blood that could have come straight out of the protocols of the elders of Zion. But he was not sanctioned or penalized in any way. So we have been negotiating all summer. I won't bore you with the details. My position is that I should have no monetary penalty, no suspension, and I will relinquish all my claims against Penn. But the negotiations are getting hung up on something called a non-disparagement clause. What is a non-disparagement clause? I can't talk about the charges against me, how they have been dealt with, how I have been treated, Penn's myriad inconsistent, mindless, and nonsensical assertions surrounding their attempts to punish me. They don't want to be criticized. Well, of course not. Now, rest assured, I know this is being videotaped, I will never sign a non-disparagement clause. I will see them in court.
Exactly.
Especially after the now deposed president, Liz McGill, told Congress under oath last December that Penn, even though a private university not obligated to do so, voluntarily honors the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. That is an out and out lie. Right? But no one at Penn has ever taken that back. I have fought for close to 3 years for basic principles of academic free expression and my right to speak out. And I want nothing less than my First Amendment rights. And here's the thing about the First Amendment, something the company men and women at Penn don't seem to get. The First Amendment protects disparagement. Indeed, I would say the First Amendment is a disparagement clause. It protects the right to criticize, to say negative things about others, about policies, about your employer, about your university, because there are a lot of negative things to say. But back to the students. When negotiating with my university, it is my students who are my ultimate focus and the personal effect on them, their education, their freedom, their future. In the statement I wrote to Larry Jameson, my president, still the president of my university, before our meeting, to explain why dropping the penalties against me in exchange for my generous offer to forego any lawsuits was fair and wise, I wrote the following. In asking the university to refrain from punishing me, I am motivated by concerns that such harsh public and unprecedented penalties will have an adverse effect, not just on the university and its reputation, but also on Penn students. I have been mentoring and advising Penn students during more than 20 years of teaching, including current students who have expressed an intent to enroll in my classes this coming fall. And my teaching has earned me a number of awards, including the prestigious university-wide Lindback Prize. In my many years at Penn, students throughout the university have reached out to me for counsel and advice, sought to learn from me to broaden their intellectual horizons, conveyed the desire to be exposed to a full range of facts and ideas, and expressed gratitude for my presence and role in the university. Regardless of any impact on me, it is disturbing, intimidating, and unfair to those students for me to suddenly be suspended or penalized. And punishing me would deprive all students of the diversity of viewpoint that the university purports to value, and would send the wrong message to the community about Penn's tolerance for unpopular or controversial ideas. Now, I don't have but a few minutes left, and there's more I could say about these personal effects of the penalties imposed upon me. One important effect is that it discourages students from having anything to do with me at all, right? Peer pressure plays a big role here. When the university disapproves and denigrates me, the students believe that I am a person who should be shunned. They absorb that message. They convey it to others. Obviously, students don't want to alienate their classmates, so they back off. And I admire the courage of those who actually ignore peer disapproval, and there are a number, who still take my courses, who still reach out to me. I know that they have gotten a lot of guff from their classmates because they tell me so. They are courageous, but there's a lot at stake for them, much more than for senior faculty like me, whose careers are coming to an end, whose children are grown, whose finances are secure. They are starting out in life. They are taking big risks, and for this, I commend them. To honor the students who've taken my classes and developed a relationship with me, I threw a big party in DC this summer at my own expense. Dozens of students from Penn and other institutions attended and socialized with each other for hours. That event alone and the enthusiastic response to it and the thanks I received made it all worthwhile. It is the future generations, our young people, who are our hope and our strength. So hats off to my hardy band, and may their numbers increase. But their numbers will only do so if people like me hang on and fight the universities as they pursue their nefarious agenda. And I can only hope that more and more academics will do that and never apologize, as I never have done and never will do, despite the very personal costs. Thank you.
Michael Myers, civil rights lawyer. My question, I could ask either, say all of them questions. I'm going to put it to Amy. Whatever happened to the response that faculty used to give when they had controversial ideas in classroom? Their answer was, so what? That's what students are here for. They hear controversial ideas, confrontation of ideas. That's what the whole purpose of education, higher education in particular. So my question to you and to the other panel members are, where in the hell are the faculty? Where are the faculty unions that are supposed to protect academic freedom and supposed to protect free speech? What happened to them? Where are the presidents and the administrators and the trustees who are supposed to believe in academic freedom? Where in the hell is the ACLU, which is supposed to believe in free speech and academic freedom, and fire the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, I guess.
Well, the ACLU, the AAUP, you know, the university presidents, the whole litany of people you just mentioned, they have bought into the whole woke mindset, and as a corollary, a lemma of that mindset is a kind of therapeutic concern with emotional safety, not hurting people's feelings, not upsetting them, especially, you know, we know minority students, okay? The sacred category, as Eric Kaufman would put it. It is a particular point of view that says academic freedom only goes up to hurtful and upsetting and no further. I will just tell you a very short anecdote. I was in southern Germany this summer, and I was passing by in Frankfurt, which is really not a German city anymore to speak of, some kind of festival on the street, and there was some very German-looking young man with a top knot, and I heard him say to someone, "Oh, we have free political speech in this country. We just can't say anything hurtful." Well, I mean, that just sums up the whole thing, doesn't it? Like, what better summary is there of the new dispensation?
I still don't understand.
Well, okay, I don't understand it either on some level.
The ACLU has power. Fire the Foundation for Individual
Well,
Rights.
fire is still abased and solid.
The unions have policies.
Yeah, but fire has no influence. How many divisions does fire have?
Trustees of the universities, whether it's the United States or Canada, they have policies. Why are they not standing up to the policies that they read and speak out all the time about? I don't understand.
I think another aspect of it is some of them think that they are standing up for the policies. They just think that when you go to a certain level of disagreement, that's not, free speech anymore, and they turn words can be hurtful, but they're not violent. But they've translated hurt into violence. So words become violence, and you'll hear this sometimes. Words are violence, One of the things I've heard is words are violence, and not to say anything is violence too. So you're kind of screwed.
Silence is violence. I love that one.
Words are violence.
Silence is violence.
Right? So, but I think that they oftentimes picture themselves as believing in free speech. In the same way that people who have totally abandoned science for this indigenous knowledge stuff will say, "Oh no, we're still for science." They're not. They've just abandoned the concepts of altogether and just redefined the words.
Although a lot of what gets said is a repudiation, outright repudiation of free speech as a tool and instrument of white supremacy and the patriarchy and all that. They'll just say, well, this is just a cover for power. That, I mean, one of the precepts of, wokeism is that everything is about power relations. And so this just allows the people in power to stay in power. I don't hear a lot of embracing free speech, full stop, frankly,
Right.
in the university. And FIRE, which is still, a terrific organization, and hats off to Greg Lukianoff. I have colleagues who say that FIRE is a nefarious, right-wing, patriarchal, extremist organization. That is what they say about FIRE. It's just insane.
Yeah.
I mean, they think FIRE is awful.
I think as well there is an argument that there's contradictory policies, first of all, and two, there's an argument that allowing free speech silences certain people.
The weak.
So there's this argument that is being made. So this really needs to be discussed very openly and honestly about how, if you say that someone shouldn't be allowed to speak, if you're making that argument, that is not a free speech argument. Like, that is not very clear right now. And you do hear this supposed defense of free speech that you need, and I guess it was Herbert Marcuse that was the first exponent of this idea, that because if you allow free speech, fascists get into power, you have to silence the fascists so that then you can have actual free speech take hold. So I think that was kind of the beginnings of that idea.
So the fourth row on
Yeah.
the end.
You're mentioning feelings. We all love feelings. Reminds me of Heather McDonald's explanation of all this, which boldly means the universities are becoming feminized. And feminization, which obviously has this past indicates, it's not necessarily a matter of gender, but more of culture and style. It's heavily related to genetics, I would argue. And that you're seeing this in the plunging number of males who are enrolled. And I haven't been on a university campus in quite some time, but I suspect that if you extract out people in mathematics, engineering, and the hard sciences, my sense would be that maybe 2/3 of the students in the social sciences and humanities are now women. And women, Heather has data on this. How many administrators are women, deans, and we know 5 Ivy League presidents have resigned in the last year, 4 of whom are women, or identified as women. I don't know. But what would be your response to this, if it is indeed credible that universities have been feminized? That's a serious matter, because if you ask any endowment officer, they'll tell you women don't give money to universities. Men give money to universities. Women give money to the ballet and the ASPCA.
Yeah, but women have husbands, unfortunately. Rich husbands.
What would your comment be on Heather's argument? This is really a matter of feminization.
Well, I've made that argument. I just did a podcast with Louise Perry. I forget the name of her podcast, but I talked at great length about feminization there and sort of expressed wonderment, a la the last comment, of why men allowed this to occur. I have said that, the ethos of the nursery and the kindergarten has now displaced the masculine virtues, really they should be universal, of objective validation, rigorous argument, give and take, evidence-based discourse, all of that, competition, sort of what I grew up with and what I was educated, because I'm old enough to remember in the 70s at Yale, you know, it was a totally different universe. My students say, wasn't it awful? I said, no, it was great. It was so much better than it is now. Yeah, so that's just denatured the university, and men have allowed it to happen. I've gotten a lot of interesting emails about that when I appeared on this podcast. One wonderful one from a PhD scientist in Toronto. He said, well, we thought we were being nice guys, and it's sort of like boiling the frog, you know. You turn around and the frog is dead. And now it's too late. Chivalry, I say in the podcast, it's chivalry run amok.
Let me add on that. One of the confirming pieces of data on it, I haven't really seen too much hard data on this, is the dramatic decline in testosterone levels.
In the what levels?
Testosterone.
Oh, yeah.
You speak to any man of a certain age.
Well, the causes of that, I don't know. We've identified.
His urologist,
Yeah.
and they will tell you that those levels are down.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Well.
not only are you demonizing, you know, the war on boys going back a few years and all that sort of stuff, but not only are you demonizing men, but men have become more emasculated. And that may be due to all kinds of things.
Some
which
of them.
have to do with the environment which we have no immediate control over. So this looks rather bleak.
It actually probably has a lot to do with weight, with fat, because estrogen, there's quite a lot of estrogen in fat cells. And so as men get fatter, they become more feminized. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated phenomenon, but I think the universities, what is going to happen, well, I'll stop. We don't, nothing good.
Let me first thank you all for your courage. On the issue of unionization, I note that the AAUP has made a statement that does condition and draw back on any commitment for free speech just in the last month. My first AAUP committee was in 1982. For my sins, I was actually the president of the AAUP at Rutgers, New Brunswick, the biggest public union of professors local in the world. The change there from a democratic slant, a pro-democratic approach, a liberal approach, was remarkable, and it to me had to do with the retirement or dying off of men who had fought in the Second World War, Korea, and there were very few Vietnam veterans. That was a big factor. And then the encampment of various cells within the union of people who were hardline leftists and academics was second or third to them. I lost my presidency to a cabal by a Brooklyn group of Trotskyists. And the best comment of that was a young man who said to me, "Is that a thing anymore?" So you can get the union to be involved in a public university. You can get them to engage in the United States on behalf of faculty rights. But then there may well be an element that's trying to do a deal with the administration, which they justify as the best goods of the whole group, to erode your rights. And that's a very common phenomenon. Somebody like me, with years in, I could maybe do something for someone, but you know, when someone like me is gone, it won't happen anymore. On the issue of NAGPRA and such, it seems to me that it is one of those cases where a group of grifters is now preying on this area. There just isn't enough ethnic hatred or racism anymore to sustain a victim industry. You've got to distill it, find fool's gold in mining for racism, and so you get this grift that generates pseudo occasions, pseudo contexts of racism that are elevated. Across my desk there recently came something about this wretched little geology museum we have at the New Brunswick campus, which accumulated in the 19th century all kinds of human remains. And it's clear, it seems to be clear that somebody's trying to work that. They're trying to find an enemy group. Who's holding them? Who are the faculty members that have these in their audiences? Blah, blah, blah. Almost the same time, something came across my desk, a petition of anthropology students that said they wanted to be forgiven from not quoting anything before 2000 in a paper in graduate school. And those things struck me as being, part and parcel of the annihilation of the real past.
Yes.
Its replacement with this construction of a past, which is either ennobled, or in the case of the classical world ride deal, is totally denigrated.
Right.
So I'd be interested to hear your comments on that, but if I may, one comment about Professor Wax's remarks. I think that the problem there is you always have to pick on the president of another institution. I went after Amy Gutman a few years ago, but since, I have a chair at Rutgers, what can she do? She only could take me off the list of receiving alumni material. A Penn doctorate in the 70s, a good one.
That's a reward.
Yes, and so on. But she couldn't even get me off the real list, somebody told me, because they were afraid that would be about it could be litigated. So I would advise everybody, find the university president you find objectionable, never your own, and go after them. Your own might spend $2.5 million in getting rid of you, as happened to me, but the other person can do anything. But the anthropologist, what do you say to that?
Well, I do think that there's a lot of grifting in the case of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Every newspaper article you'll read has some kind of quote about there's 40,000 more artifacts that haven't been repatriated, or thousands of bones in this area and that. And when you actually look at what is now being repatriated, it's really garbage, and literally garbage. So they're starting to ask for soil back, for fossilized feces, so coprolites, because the actual stuff that showed a historical link to tribes or to literal family connections has already been repatriated. And so now the movement has shifted from something that still I would be against, but I could tolerate it and say, well, yeah, I'm not for it, but there is a link, to, we want everything back, even our refuse, even our garbage, even our shit, and part of that is this kind of grifting. So I do think that, and many of those Native Americans really are not Native Americans, and which is one of the reasons why I use the term pretendian in my title, because many of them are new tribes that didn't even exist 30 years ago. And so this is a whole another dimension of that grift.
Can I just say one thing more generally? We have these huge DEI establishments, and these people, it just came up at an NAS Heritage panel not long ago. What do these people do all day? Well, they make mischief. They have to find stuff to do. And more than one person has asked me this question.
And as a comment on the unions, I know all about this. They have been completely captured by wokeism. The activists and the people don't really want to put in the time, especially in the current climate, and the unions are taken over, and it is almost impossible to deal with the unions now in terms of their particular embracing of diversity, inclusion, and equity ideas.
Let's go to the back, the woman in the orange or top.
I just want to go quickly back to the freedom of speech issue. There's an old joke from the Soviet times when an American says, we have freedom of speech, we can criticize America. And the person from the Soviet Union says, but we do too.
Yeah. In the front.
Yeah, on the subject of free speech, which is very, very near and dear to my heart, I'm not an academic, but I've tried free speech. And here's how it works, quote unquote. In the United States, if you publish your book yourself, so I had some ideas about terrorism and religion actually before 9/11, and was trying to publish a book, and then nobody would take it. And I said, okay, this is America, the country of opportunity. I'm an ex-Soviet. Let's try it. So I'm going to publish it myself. And the interesting thing is that the government actually blocks you. They do not want you to speak out of your own mouth. They basically have something called cataloging and publication, where they announce to the trade and the libraries the upcoming titles, and this they only give to third-party corporate publishers. They officially say, if you are speaking out of your own mouth, we're not giving it to you. And what the effect of that is that it denies the book the visibility in the marketplace of ideas. So yeah, the tree fell in the forest, who heard it, doesn't really matter. So I tried to sue, and the result was that it was like really surreal, where judges take your lawyer's argument and the government lawyer's argument, and then they throw it all into the garbage. They come up with their own argument, and they decide, they approve of their own argument, and they decide based on their own argument. So I sued a bunch of federal judges for fraud, and they said, in Pearson against Ray, we judges gave ourselves the right to act from the bench, quote unquote, maliciously and corruptly. So, but when you fail corruptly and maliciously, what are you complaining about? But in any event, my question is about free speech, is about control, because free speech seems to be breaking the controls. If you don't have free speech, if everyone is supposed to toe the line, and as an ex-Soviet, I know how it works, then there is control. Top down, you can tell people to march to orders. And when you do have free speech, it becomes much, much more problematic. So free speech is kind of inherently
Subversive.
Yes, it is inherently subversive,
Yes.
and which is why it needs protection in the Constitution, because else the government is just going to instantly squash it, as it does it all over the world, except for the U.S. And it seems to me that universities are kind of corporate structures, and you are supposed to toe the line from the standpoint of the administration, of the president, et cetera, and when you exercise free speech, you kind of break the discipline, you break all that, so you're being, subversive or whatever it is, so.
Well, I think the only thing I would say to that is, if the university were operating properly, it would take seriously the Calvin Report exhortation to be neutral.
Exactly.
Okay?
Yeah.
And of course, that's been abandoned long ago with this DIE agenda and the kind of the highly politicized tilt of the university getting involved in all of these different topics. Now, Harvard recently sort of said, well, we're gonna reassess the Calvin Report. Here's the problem, and here's why it's toothless, what they're doing. Because they say, well, if it pertains to our function as a university, then we can have an opinion. Well, the whole DIE space can be claimed to pertain to their function as a university. It is our purpose to promote diversity because diversity promotes learning, and the whole, all that bullshit, because that's really what it is, that comes out of the Supreme Court's affirmative action cases. In other words, there's an enormous loophole in the Calvin neutrality pledge that the universities, can take advantage of. So I have seen nothing like neutrality from the university. Steven Pinker's very good on this. He says, a little bit like what John Roberts says about judges and justices. They're just umpires. Universities don't speak. People within the university speak, right? A university can't have an opinion. People within the university have an opinion, but we're so far from that concept now that it sort of would be very difficult to come back from that.
Yeah, and the last time I heard something good from a president was Martha Piper from the University of British Columbia said, the university does not have a position. The university provides a forum for its members to come together to discuss these matters.
Perfect. I mean,
Perfect.
Why can't they all
Let's,
say
hey, let's have this again.
like interesting? You see, a lot of this is just self-stroking, like making your job fun and interesting, and the more you mess around with different issues and get to pontificate about them, the more fun your job is. You have a bully pulpit.
So there were a couple things that I just came to my mind, and I'll head into a question pretty soon. On the idea of like harm, we were talking about words as violence just now, right? It's funny, my eye caught this book over here, Woke Racism by John McWhorter. He goes into a lot of depth on that very topic. Also, Vincent Lloyd, who is a political theology professor. He has an article in Compact where he discusses this as well. And then also, there's a question earlier about kind of why aren't faculty and presidents and administration standing up for free speech. Mark Moyer has a recent piece in the Chronicle, and in part he contributes an answer to this question. Dr. Weiss, you alluded to it with your Yale anecdote, talking about the aging out of people who would have stood up for these concepts, and the new guard, as it were, don't so much. My question is a logistical one for the full panel. When you guys were in your hearings, I'm just curious, was hearsay allowed as evidence in the proceedings in the college?
Everything is allowed. The most outrageous things were allowed. I mean, don't get me started.
Mine,
It's not a court of law. We kept being reminded.
I wasn't. I didn't do any proceedings in the university, just in the
you
court
were
of
not.
law, right? So I did go in front of a judge twice, and although they wouldn't have said certain things were hearsay, they were hearsay. Okay. So the lines were blurred, I would say. I would also say that the first time we went in front of the judge, I knew things were going badly right away when the judge said, "How would I feel if this was my grandmother that you were holding in that photo?" And I was like, "Oh no." So, but what was interesting was so there was a motion to dismiss, which she granted, but then she allowed me to amend the complaint and come back, and she actually turned it around and said that I did make the case, and I was with Pacific Legal Foundation, and basically one of the things was that the university lawyer got too cocky, and in his rebuttal of my complaint, basically started, said things like that my mannerism and so forth were inappropriate, really attacking me personally. And she was like, didn't take that, and I think that helped me in that sense. But in one way, a lot of people are so communicating with emails constantly that a lot of the things that were said were not just hearsay verbally, but actually email. And so I think that really kind of builds the cases sometimes now, especially among professors. Professors can't stop themselves from sending emails.
So mine was arbitration. I don't know what Amy, what was your?
Mine was just an internal Senate, hearing. The hearing was ill-defined because the faculty handbook is so skeletal.
Okay. Anyway,
Doesn't say
arbitration.
anything. It
So
says, well, we try to provide due process.
yeah, so arbitration, they pretty much allow everything in.
Reform.
and then the arbitrator decides whether it's going to be valid or not. This is a huge problem. I was always arguing for the open court principle in the process, but there's a lot of control that the arbitrator has over the situation, and as a result of arbitration, they argue that it's faster and things can be resolved, more informally, but it's incredibly legal, the process, with all the legal trappings, but you do not have any of the protections that happen in the court of law. So it is just like a lose-lose situation, unfortunately.